I keep a tally on the inside of my locker door. 14 months. That's how long it was between the day she disappeared and the day the first drone activated on Fargate Street in Sheffield and killed a man named Alec Proctor who was on his way to buy bread. 14 months between losing her and properly understanding, that we were on our own. I know that sounds bleak. It was bleak, but I'm not telling this story to dwell on the dark parts. I'm telling it because someone ought to have the whole shape of it written down somewhere, and because Graham said I should, and Graham is usually right about that kind of thing, even if he's wrong about most others. My name is Ryan Sinclair. For about 3 years I helped save the world more times than I can count. Then I came home to Sheffield, got a job delivering packages, and spent 10 months trying to convince myself that was fine. It wasn't fine. Yaz kept the TARDIS. She couldn't fly it, couldn't even get the doors open half the time without the right knock pattern she'd memorized from watching. But she stayed inside it the way you stay beside someone in a hospital, not because there's anything useful to do, but because leaving feels wrong. Graham and I would go round. We'd knock. She'd open the door with this look on her face like she'd just woken up from a dream she was still half inside. And we'd sit in that big humming room full of coral light and drink tea and talk about nothing important. The thing about losing someone who doesn't die, who just disappears into places you can't follow, is that grief has nowhere to land. There's no funeral, no grave. There's just this hollow space in the calendar where extraordinary things used to happen, and you fill it with deliveries and takeaway curry and lying awake at 3 in the morning turning over every detail of the last conversation you had, wondering if there was something you missed. You replay the last look on their face. You replay what you said and whether it was the thing you actually meant or just the version of the thing that seemed safe to say out loud. You think about all the questions you didn't ask because you assumed there would be more time. Graham dealt with it by volunteering. Community garden, Meals on Wheels. He threw himself at ordinary life like a man trying to put out a fire with his hands. I'd see him twice a week, and every time he looked a little older and a little steadier, the way grief settles on people who meet it head-on rather than going around it. He cooked. He planted things. He called his stepson in Leeds twice a week and told him nothing important in a warm voice. I dealt with it by not dealing with it. I delivered packages during the day. I played football on Thursday evenings. I started reading books I'd told myself I'd get to eventually, and found I couldn't keep the words in my head because my head was somewhere else entirely. The dyspraxia meant my hands didn't always do what I asked them to, which had always been true but felt worse now, felt like a rebuke somehow, like the universe reminding me that I was exactly who I was and no more and no less, and that whatever had made the previous 3 years possible had left with her. Then Yaz sent us a message. She'd found something on a leaked government server. Security footage from a riot in Rotherham, manufactured, she said, staged. And in the middle of it, moving through the crowd like something out of a nightmare I used to have, was a machine I recognized. Tall, gray, armored. A domed head that turned on a slow, rotating joint. A single arm ending in a weapon that looked like nothing designed for anything but killing. I'd seen that shape before. I'd run from that shape. I'd watched it bear down on people I cared about in a blizzard in Sheffield in what felt like another lifetime. I'd stood in a room afterward and watched what it had taken from us, and I'd made the kind of private promise you make in moments like that which you don't say out loud because saying it out loud makes it too large to carry. I'd helped bury what was left of one, not far from where we were standing. I said, "That's not a security drone." Graham looked at the screen for a long time, then he said, "No, it isn't." Jack Robertson was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to be involved in something like this. I want to be fair about that. He wasn't a villain in the operatic sense, no dark lair, no monologue about power. He was just a man who saw opportunity everywhere he looked and had enough money that opportunity kept saying yes. He wore it the way some men wear a good suit, constantly, naturally, without ever questioning whether it was appropriate to the occasion. He had the smile of a man who has never been in a room he didn't believe he owned. He'd salvaged the original wreckage, or had someone salvage it for him. That's a more accurate way to put it, because men like Robertson don't do the dirty work themselves. They acquire, they leverage, they hire a Leo Ruggiesi. I didn't know Ruggiesi at the time. We found out about him later. Young man, brilliant by all accounts. The kind of scientist who sees a biological sample under a microscope and can't stop himself pulling on the thread. The kind of mind that is so interested in how things work that the question of whether they should work becomes secondary and then tertiary and then disappears from the agenda entirely. He'd found organic residue inside the casing, traces of what had piloted it, microscopic remnants of the creature inside. And instead of burning it, because burning it was the sane and correct response to finding alien organic material inside a war machine, he'd grown it. He'd cultured the cells, nurtured them, given them warmth and nutrients and time, the way you give those things to something you're invested in, something you want to understand. That's not entirely a criticism of Ruggiesi, actually. He didn't know what he was doing. He thought he was doing science. He thought the creature was just an exotic form of squid, novel and interesting, a discovery worth protecting. The way I understand it, he showed Robertson what he'd cultured, and Robertson told him to destroy it, and then Ruggiesi did something that should have ended everything early. He didn't. He was curious. I understand that. I've been curious about the wrong thing before. The difference between Ruggiesi and me is that his curiosity built an army. By the time Yaz spotted the footage, there were defense drones rolling out across 3 counties, with a politician named Joe Patterson planning to put them in every city in the country. Zero cost to the taxpayer, she was saying. A new era of public safety. She was weeks away from becoming prime minister on the back of it, standing at podiums in front of the things, beaming at cameras, calling them the future of community protection. And in a facility outside Osaka, Japan, in a building with no external windows and climate control that kept the temperature at exactly 4 degrees Celsius, something that had been a small gray smear of biological material 6 months earlier was now housed inside a tank and had begun communicating with others of its kind. We didn't know about Osaka yet. We went to confront Robertson at his building one night. That seems stupid now, thinking about it. 3 people with no authority, no evidence that would hold up to any legal scrutiny, and no backup. We walked up to him in his own car park like we were going to talk him out of it, like we could appeal to his better nature, which was an error based on assuming he had one within relevant operating range. He laughed at us, or not exactly laughed. It was more like the expression you'd use if a polite inconvenience turned out to be slightly less inconvenient than expected. He had his guards escort us out. Not aggressively, he wasn't the type to cause a scene in his own facility, just firmly, the way you remove a problem rather than engage with it. Efficient and dismissive. The guards were professional about it, which almost made it worse. I remember standing on the pavement outside with Graham and Yaz, watching the building's lights. Sheffield at night, orange glow off the low cloud, a couple taxis going past. Graham looked up at the windows for a moment. Then he said, "We need her," not accusatory, just a statement of fact the way he says most things. We need her, like nodding that you've run out of milk. He was right. Without her, we were 3 people with mobile phones and a van. We could see something was wrong. We could feel the shape of something building. We couldn't do a thing about it. That night back in the TARDIS, Yaz started a new wall of notes. She'd been doing it for months, sheets of paper covered in her neat handwriting, photographs, printouts, everything she'd gathered, trying to map something she couldn't see the edges of. I watched her move from one note to another, connecting them with lengths of string, squinting at the connections the way you squint at something you're almost certain about but need one more piece to confirm. Her face in those moments was completely focused. I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who, when the person they relied on disappears, responds by methodically trying to do the work themselves instead of stopping. I thought about what Jack had said to Yaz once, about what it does to you, traveling with someone like her, being part of something that big for that long. About how you become someone who can't quite fit back into the world you left, because the world you left was designed for someone slightly smaller than you've become. I didn't say any of that. I made tea instead. Jack Harkness arrived without warning, the way he does everything. I heard the sound first, that mechanical wheeze and thud, like something very large settling its weight, and then a blue box materialized in the corner of the room we'd been using as an operations center. Not the TARDIS. A different one. Older looking somehow, the blue more faded, the panels darker and slightly scuffed, like it had been through more than the ship was showing on the outside. Out stepped a man in a long military coat, with the kind of face that looked like it had been weathered by more decades than anyone should have to carry. I'd met Jack once before, briefly, and he hadn't changed, which sounds like a mundane observation until you understand what it actually means, that he genuinely hadn't changed, not a line on his face different, not a strand of gray, because Jack Harkness runs at a different clock rate than the rest of us. He'd been alive so long that he'd stopped meaning it as a metaphor. He'd been alive long enough to be bored of being immortal, and then interested in it again, and then bored again. And what came out the other side of that was a kind of equanimity that looked superficially like charm, but was actually something quieter and more serious. He shook my hand and called me by name. He embraced Graham like a brother, one of those genuine full-arm holds that people only give to people they mean it with. He looked at Yaz and said, "She told me about you, said you were the one who kept them focused." Then he looked around the room and said, "We've got a problem." We knew that, we told him. "No," he said, "you know part of a problem, I know the rest of it." He'd been tracking signals. His coat had more technology sewn into it than most governments can afford, and some of it was oriented toward detecting a specific kind of encoded transmission, the kind that shouldn't be possible from Earth, because the technology to generate it had been buried and melted and formally declared destroyed. He'd been picking up fragments of that signal for 2 months, getting stronger, more structured. The early transmissions had been simple, almost like breathing, he said, like something reminding itself it was alive, minimal, exploratory, the way a signal sounds when it's still establishing that communication is possible. The recent ones were organized, deliberate, directional. Something was calling for help. And something else, a very long way away, had heard. He spread a map on the table. The signal origin was in Japan, marked in red. Overlapping it in blue was the cone of the incoming response signal, too large, he said, too ordered to be a scout or a probe. Whatever was answering the call had resources. Jack said, "We have maybe 3 days before they arrive." Yaz looked at the map for a long time. Then she said, "Then we'd better go to Osaka." The facility in Osaka was worse than we'd imagined. Jack and Yaz went in first. I remember watching their signal on the map application we'd rigged up on a borrowed tablet, 2 small dots moving through what was supposed to be a decommissioned pharmaceutical plant, in an industrial area that the surrounding streets had quietly reorganized themselves to avoid. Businesses that should have been nearby had moved. The roadside businesses that serve industrial workers had thinned out. The area had the particular quality of a space that humans have stopped choosing to be near, without being able to articulate why. Graham and I were a mile out in the van, listening on comms. We heard Yaz's breathing change before she said anything. That small catch in the throat that means you've seen something that recalibrates your understanding of the situation you're in. A fractional hesitation between one breath and the next. I'd heard it before, on her and on Graham and on myself, in rooms and corridors and open spaces that turned out to be different from what we'd expected. It's the sound of the brain buying itself half a second to update. Then, Ryan, Graham, there are thousands of them. Not drones, tanks, row after row of growing chambers, each one lit from inside by a dim amber light, each one containing a half-formed creature suspended in fluid. Some were small, early stage, the original stock replicating itself at a rate that the original had never been intended to achieve, because the original had been one creature adapting, and these were many creatures optimizing. Others were larger, fully formed, pressed against the glass with their eye stalks rotating, and their appendages moving in slow experimental patterns, like something testing the limits of a new body, learning what it was. They were alive, they were aware, and they had been grown inside machines designed to kill. Jack found Rugesi in a back office. The man had been dead for weeks, by the look of it. I won't describe what I saw on the monitors later when Jack sent back the images. The relevant fact is that the facility had continued operating after Rugesi's death, which meant that whatever had been in his head during the final weeks of his life had been directing the operation, and when the body stopped being useful, the operation had simply continued under its own momentum. We found Patterson dead that same day, on a news alert that came through on Graham's phone. Prime Minister-elect, shot at a press conference by a source her own security detail hadn't identified as a threat. The report used the word assassination but didn't have a suspect. I thought about the drone that had been standing 10 feet away from her. I thought about how those things communicated, how quickly they could assess and target and execute, and I thought about what it would mean for an alien intelligence to decide that a useful political asset had outlived her usefulness, had served her function, had provided what was needed: national deployment, political cover, infrastructure access, and was now simply a loose end. It had started. I need to explain what happened in the hours after Osaka, because the sequence matters and the speed of it matters. The creatures activated simultaneously, all across the country, all across several countries, actually, because Robertson had sold the contracts internationally, because a man like Robertson thinks in markets. The defense drones stopped being defense drones. Their helmets cracked open, or irised open, or in some cases simply split along seams that had always been there but hadn't been visible before. Creatures poured out of them and into new shells that were bigger, heavier, already waiting. The machines that had been advertised as public safety tools became something else in the space of 30 minutes, and the first thing they did was take to the streets. I was on Fargate when the first one activated. That's where I heard Alec Proctor die. I didn't know his name then. I looked it up later because it seemed important to know. He was 52 years old. He'd worked at the council for 23 years. He was on his way to buy bread for his wife because she'd asked him to pick some up and he'd said he would. There were people running everywhere, screaming in that particular way people scream when they don't understand what's happening, when fear has outpaced comprehension, and the body is operating on older instructions than thought can issue. The sound of weapons discharging, that specific crack and hiss that I'd hoped never to hear again, the sound those things make when they fire, a noise that has no equivalent in anything human-made, no resonance in any sound I'd heard before the first time I encountered one. Like light being torn. I pulled 2 people into a doorway, told them to stay down, to wait, to not make noise. Couldn't do anything else. There were only 3 of us and we had nothing. I stood in the doorway with my hands flat against the brick and watched a drone move down the street below, its weapon arm sweeping in a systematic arc, and I felt the helplessness of it settle on my chest like weight. This was the thing we'd been afraid of, and the thing we couldn't stop, and the reason we needed her, and the reason she wasn't there. Yaz found us 20 minutes later. Graham had a cut above his eye from falling. Yaz had lost her phone. We crouched in an alley behind a shuttered restaurant and tried to work out what to do. "We need a plan," Yaz said. I said, "We need more than a plan." What we needed was a miracle. What we got about 40 seconds later was Jack Harkness dropping out of a door that opened in the air 6 feet off the ground, landing on the paving stones with a roll that looked practiced, because it was practiced, because he'd been doing this for longer than any of us had been alive, and saying, "Good, you're all alive." And then she's on her way. I want to say something about what it feels like to be told that, after 14 months, after all of it. I don't have the right words for it. I've tried, in the months since, to write it down properly, to find the language that fits what happened in the few seconds after Jack said those words, and I can't. Language is designed for things that fit inside human experience, and some things sit at the edge of that and require you to gesture at them obliquely rather than name them directly. I'll say this, it didn't feel like relief. Relief is for situations that have been difficult but manageable, situations where you could see the shape of the problem and were doing your best against it and needed the pressure to lift. This was something else. This was more like the moment when a bone sets a sudden sharp thing that is painful and necessary and right, and that you feel all the way through from the surface to the center. Not comfort, not restoration, more like reorientation, a compass finding north. She arrived in the TARDIS on the bridge above the river, about a mile from where we were. I heard the sound before I saw it. We were running by then, following Jack's signal on a handheld unit he'd passed to Yaz, moving through streets that smelled of smoke and something electrical, dodging in and out of doorways as drones moved above us in formation. Their sensors sweeping patterns we'd figured out were on a predictable cycle if you counted. The sound came first. That impossible sound, like the universe flexing, like time itself clearing its throat. I've described it to people who have never heard it, and there's no description that does it. It's not a mechanical noise, not exactly. It's more like the sound of a place becoming more real, of something very old and very alive asserting its presence in a moment that was ready for it. Then the blue box materialized on the bridge parapet, and the doors opened. She looked the same. She was the same, I think, except for something around the eyes that hadn't been there before, a quality of stillness, a depth of patience, like someone who has spent a great deal of time alone with their own thoughts and has come to a certain arrangement with them. She took in the situation without appearing to scan it, just absorbed it the way she absorbs things all at once. Looked at the sky, where the drones were moving in formation above the rooftops. Looked at each of us in turn. Landed on my face for a moment. Then she said, in that voice that is simultaneously the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing I've ever heard, "Right then, tell me everything." We told her everything. Graham talked for most of it, in that organized way he has, the one he says he learned from 30 years of driving a bus. Because when you drive the same route twice a day, you learn how information needs to be ordered if people are going to get off at the right stop. He gives you facts in the sequence that makes them intelligible, without flourish, without editorializing. He's good at it in a way that most people who are good at things don't know they're good at them. And it's most visible in moments of stress when everyone else is fragmented, and Graham is just quietly and methodically building the picture. Yaz filled in the gaps, the technical details, the signal analysis Jack had walked her through, the layout of the Osaka facility, the timeline of Patterson's death and its probable cause. She spoke in the same tone she used to use when she was filing incident reports, which is to say clearly and without editorializing, but with the slight additional weight that comes from knowing what you're describing isn't hypothetical. Jack stood by the door with his arms folded, adding the pieces we hadn't seen, the incoming fleet's estimated composition, the signal characteristics that told him what they were, the timeline. She listened without interrupting. That was new. The version of her I'd traveled with for 3 years would have been talking over us before we'd finished the first sentence, connecting pieces before we'd given them to her, half running toward a conclusion while we were still constructing the premise, moving so fast that sometimes you felt like you were trying to hand something to someone sprinting away. This version was still. She stood in the center of the TARDIS control room with her hands at her sides, and she listened, and her face was doing work that wasn't visible on the surface, assembling and assessing and cataloging, but none of it leaked out. When Graham finished, she was quiet for a moment. The TARDIS hummed around us. Outside the windows, at the edge of what was visible, a drone moved along a roofline. She said, "The ones outside. They cloned from the residue. Human DNA in the mix unavoidable, given the environment, the method. We nodded. And they've been broadcasting. Jack said for 2 months. She closed her eyes, opened them, said, then they've been answered. She showed us on the TARDIS screen a signal analysis she'd pulled from the ship's receiver, showing 2 data streams mapped against each other. The one originating from Earth, the local cloned creatures, broadcasting outward in a pattern we now recognized as organizational, structural, directional, not distress, exactly, more like announcement. We are here. We are growing. We are ready. And a second stream, inbound, enormous, a signal so large and ordered it looked like a wall of light on the analysis display. The kind of signal that requires a sender of considerable mass and organization. The Purity Fleet, she said. It wasn't a name I'd heard before. She explained what it meant in flat, factual terms, the way a doctor explains a diagnosis to someone old enough to hear it straight. There were factions, she said. There had always been factions. It was almost the only human quality she'd ever identified in them. The cloned creatures were considered contaminated, impure, because the process that had grown them had inevitably introduced human biological material into the replication, the growth environment, the temperature regulation, the very air of the planet. You can't grow something in a place without that place leaving some trace. The incoming fleet did not consider this an accident or a misfortune. It considered it a crime against the integrity of the species, an abomination, and their doctrine was simple and ancient. Abominations are to be exterminated. Both the abomination and whatever produced it. Both sides, Yaz said very quietly. They're both going to exterminate us. The clones will exterminate us because that's what they do, because that is the complete and total content of their purpose, she said. The fleet will exterminate the clones and us, because we're standing in the same sector of the same planet and they won't make distinctions. To them, we are the contamination that produced the clones. We are the source material. We are the problem. I looked at Graham. Graham looked at me. So we're caught in the middle of an alien civil war, I said. Welcome back, she said. And there was something in it, not humor exactly, but the shape of humor, the ghost of it, holding a weight it couldn't otherwise hold. The fleet arrived in orbit within the hour. I watched it from the bridge. 6 vessels. The smallest one was the size of an aircraft carrier. They came in from the night side, the ones at the edge catching the Terminator light in brief flashes of bronze and gray, and they arranged themselves above the planet with the calm, unhurried confidence of something that has never once considered the possibility of failure. Nothing tentative about their approach. No exploratory passes, no defensive positioning. They just arrived, the way a machine arrives in a pre-planned location, inevitably already knowing the outcome. Weapon systems extended from their ventral surfaces. Scanning beams swept across the surface in broad, slow arcs, tagging the location of every contaminated unit below, and everything else in proximity, by the look of the beam patterns, which were thorough in the way that preparation for total clearance is thorough. Then they launched. The sky above the river filled with descending forms, armored, heavy, moving in precise formation, utterly silent except for the sound the air made as they displaced it. Not like a military assault which has improvisation in it, has angles and decisions and the human variable of fear. More like something administrative, like something coming down to deal with a known problem according to a procedure established a long time ago. The clones came up to meet them. I'd never watched 2 factions of the same creature fight each other before. I don't recommend it. The purity of the tactical logic was nauseating, both sides advancing on each other without hesitation, without adaptation, without any of the small improvised moments that mark how people actually fight. No caution, no reaction to loss that modified behavior, just calculation and fire and the mathematics of extermination, perfectly regular, like watching a machine process material. The clones died by the dozens on the bridge. The descent units swept them, faster, more heavily armored, carrying weapons with substantially more power than anything the clones had managed to reverse engineer from human manufacturing processes. The clones' weapons were effective but lighter, less accurate. The kind of limitation that comes from being manufactured without the full technical knowledge of your own design, from reconstructing a blueprint from first principles with incomplete data. They went down, and the ones that replaced them went down too, and after 4 minutes of this, every clone that had come out to the bridge was dead. The descent unit stood on the bridge, turned their sensors toward us. She was already inside the TARDIS, doing the thing she'd been preparing for the last 40 minutes. The plan was this. She would draw the descent units to a second TARDIS, the old one Jack had arrived in, which she'd spent the better part of an hour adjusting to do something it had never been designed to do. Once she had them inside, or close enough that proximity achieved the necessary effect, she would collapse it, not destroy it in the conventional sense. Fold it. Compress the interior geometry until the outside and inside were reversed, and then push the result into a void between dimensions that has no proper name and no exit. Whatever went in wouldn't come out. It would persist, technically, but in a dimension where persistence is indistinguishable from ending. Jack, Graham, and I would go aboard the command ship, the fleet's mother vessel, the largest of the 6, the one that was running the coordination signal, without which the fleet would lose its cohesion. Jack had the technology to get us there, a portable transporter built into the wrist unit on his left arm, the kind of thing that shouldn't exist because the energy requirements alone should make it impossible, and the miniaturization required to put it in a wrist unit should make it doubly impossible. He'd had it for decades. He'd never told me where he got it, and I'd stopped asking. We had explosives, Jack's explosives, which were not the kind of explosives you can buy in a hardware store or describe to a licensing authority without prompting a visit from several serious government agencies. Small dents, each one about the size of a thumb. Jack carried them in a case that looked ordinary, which I'd learned was a characteristic of things Jack carried. The weight of them when he pressed 2 into my hand was surprising for their size. We would distribute them through the key structural points of the command ship and get out before they went off. The contingency, the part she said with the careful neutral tone she uses when she doesn't want you to fully register what she's saying, the tone that is even and calm in a way that is specifically designed to not set off alarm responses, was that if we couldn't get out in time, the explosives could be detonated remotely, from outside, by her. I understood what that meant. I've been around long enough to understand what that means. I looked at Graham, and Graham nodded once, small, the particular nod of someone who has already gone through the moral calculation and arrived at acceptance. Jack said, "I've been in tighter spots." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you, so you have the full picture." "Understood," Graham said. "Ryan," she said. I looked at her for a moment. At those eyes that had been still for 14 months in a prison somewhere I couldn't picture, wearing it as quietly as she wore everything else. 14 months, and she'd come back carrying it without showing it, the way people carry the worst things, folded small and held somewhere interior. "Yeah," I said, "understood." We transported in 3 seconds. One moment I was standing on wet pavement with the smell of smoke in the air, and the distant sound of weapons fire several streets away. Then a sensation like every electron in my body being politely asked to move about 400 kilometers and immediately relocated upon arrival. There's no good way to describe it, the feeling. Not painful. More like the worst kind of dizziness compressed into an instant, a complete spatial discontinuity that the body registers as wrongness before it registers where it's arrived. And then I was standing in a corridor that was dark and narrow and smelled of nothing. No air recycled through filters, no human machine smell, nothing organic. The atmosphere was maintained at breathable levels, but the air itself was stripped of everything that isn't strictly required for respiration. Functional air. Air that doesn't pretend to be anything other than a necessary utility. The corridors were sized wrong. Not too small, too large, in a way that took a second to parse, a second to identify what was creating the sense of wrongness. The proportions were slightly off the human scale, designed for something that didn't have human dimensions, and moving through them felt like walking through a building designed for a species that was almost you but not quite. Everything approximately right, specifically wrong. Jack went first. He moved through the space with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done this many times and survived most of them. Not reckless, just very practiced. Graham second, moving quietly in a way that reminded me he'd been the kind of person who stayed calm in difficult situations long before he met us. 30 years of navigating Sheffield traffic in a bus teaches you something about keeping your composure when things around you are bad. Me at the back, carrying the 2 charges Jack had given me plus the detonation unit that was slightly larger than a mobile phone and had 1 switch. We had a rough internal schematic that Jack had derived from sensor data on the way up, assembled quickly but apparently accurately. He'd done this before with less information, he said. 4 structural points. Engine coupling nodes at the ship's stern, deep enough in the structure that destroying them would compromise propulsion and guidance simultaneously. Weapons relay array midship, the routing hub through which targeting data moved. Primary navigation spine running along the dorsal axis, a redundant but critical system. And the communication hub, which Jack said was the most critical of all. If we could knock out the communication hub before we detonated, the rest of the fleet would have no coordinating signal and would likely retreat to await orders that would never come. Without the command vessel talking, the other 5 ships would hold position according to protocol and wait. 20 minutes to plan everything, 10 to get out. That was the plan. What actually happened was that Robertson was already on board. I don't know exactly when he made the decision. My best guess, from what Jack pieced together afterward, was that he'd been watching the clones get destroyed on the bridge and made a calculation of the kind a certain type of man makes when he sees the largest force in the room winning decisively. He'd weighed the numbers. 6 enormous ships versus a contingent of cloned creatures manufactured in an Osaka warehouse, and he'd reached the conclusion that a man who wanted to survive should be aligned with the larger number. He'd walked forward, hands visible, speaking in that measured American tone he uses when he's selling something, claiming to be the leader of the species, which was such a demonstrable lie that it almost warranted a different kind of respect, the kind you extend to audacity regardless of its ethics, and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. They'd let him aboard, which tells you something about how they think. They are interested in utility. They don't have contempt for species that collaborate. They have a place in their hierarchy for things that are useful. A human who approaches willingly and offers information is an asset for as long as the information is valuable, and Robertson was nothing if not efficient at making himself appear valuable. Jack heard him before he saw him, heard the voice coming from a larger chamber off the main corridor, measured and clear, and containing that particular quality of Robertson's voice, which is the quality of a man who has convinced himself that what he's doing is rational, saying, "She's not operating alone. She has backup on board this ship right now." Jack put a hand up, stopping us. I heard a voice respond. I'm going to struggle to describe this accurately, because the description keeps coming out wrong when I try to give it human qualities, and it had none. It was the sound of pure intent given mechanical vibration. No variation for emotion, none of the micro fluctuations in pitch and rhythm that human speech carries even when we're trying to be neutral. No softness at the edges, no hesitation, nothing that indicated the speaker had any relationship with uncertainty. A voice that had evolved or been engineered, or had simply become over a very long time, a perfect instrument for the expression of judgment and the delivery of sentences that end in extermination. It said location. Robertson said, "I'll give you her location in exchange for safe passage for me and my people." Then he named her. Jack's jaw set. He looked at us. Not angry, Jack doesn't waste energy on anger when there's work to do, just calculating, the eyes doing the math. Change of schedule, he said very quietly. We've got about 4 minutes before they come looking, maybe less. We moved faster. Jack split the remaining charges, Graham took the engine nodes. He'd been a mechanic before he drove the bus, and Jack said that would help him find the coupling points by instinct rather than by blueprint, by the feel of a system under load rather than its appearance on a schematic. Jack took the communication hub, the most critical point, the one where a mistake in placement would waste the charge. I took the navigation spine. I want to tell you that my section went smoothly. It didn't. The navigation spine ran along a corridor that was active patrolled, in the sense that units moved through it on a cycle that wasn't random. I had to time my movements against the rotation of a sensor array, pressing myself into alcoves that were slightly too shallow for me, feeling the wall against my spine, listening to the mechanical rotation as it passed. I planted the first charge and moved, planted the second. The third was straightforward. The fourth was at a junction that was actively in use, units moving through it, the cycle not giving me a gap long enough to get in place and get out without being detected. I stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably 90 seconds, watching the junction, thinking. My hands were not entirely steady. The dyspraxia is always there, in the background, the slight mismatch between what I intend and what my hands do, and in situations like this it becomes foreground. Then I thought, it doesn't have to be the junction, it has to be the spine. And the spine runs through the junction, but it also runs behind the wall panel to my right. I took the panel off with my hands. It was designed to be removed, maintenance access, same concept as any ship, even one built by something nothing like us. Behind it was the spine, a thick bundle of conduits pulsing with something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite energy, some third thing. Some technology built for a scale of operation that human engineering doesn't have language for yet. I planted the charge on the primary conduit, feeling the slight heat of it through my fingers, replaced the panel as carefully as I'd removed it, and walked away. 3 minutes. We were 2 corridors from the extraction point when the alarm went. Not an alarm the way we'd understand it, no siren, no flashing light. Just a shift in the ship itself, a change in the quality of the vibration under my feet that went from neutral to purposeful, a subtle change in air pressure. Jack had described this exact thing during the briefing. He'd said, when the ship changes, run. We ran. Graham was already at the extraction point, coming in from the engine section with the quiet, slightly faster than walking pace of someone who has spent 30 years not running for the bus, but always knowing where the bus is. Jack came out of a side corridor at the same moment I reached the main one, tucking the wrist unit under his coat, and we were almost there, almost at the point where Jack could initiate extraction, when a unit came around the corner at the far end. It was different from the clones. Where the clones had been manufactured with incomplete schematics, this was the genuine article, bronze and heavy, and moving with a deliberate precision that the clones could approximate but not match. Its weapon arm came up. The shot passed between Jack and me, close enough that I felt the heat of it on my left arm, not the burn of a hit but the warmth of proximity, which is a distinction that felt very significant in the moment. A foot to the right and this is a different story. Jack turned mid-stride. He had a weapon of his own. I'd known he was carrying it, small and tucked under the coat, the kind of weapon that looks understated until it isn't. He fired twice, which slowed the unit, didn't stop it, slowed it, and then we were moving again, Graham grabbing my arm, pulling, and Jack pivoting and following in one smooth motion. We came around the extraction corner. Robertson was there. Alone, backed against the wall, the confident measured tone completely gone. Whatever deal he'd thought he was negotiating had evidently reached the natural conclusion that deals with that kind of entity always reach, which is the moment when your utility runs out and your status changes from asset to material. He'd seen it. He understood. His face had the look of a man who has run out of every card he owns and is watching the hand play out anyway. "Take me with you," he said. Jack looked at him for about half a second. Then he grabbed Robertson's arm with the same hand that held the wrist unit, and Yaz's signal came through on the comms, clear, firm, steady. "Now, Jack," and the world dissolved and reassembled itself into cold air and the smell of the river, and the sound of the second TARDIS doing something extraordinary somewhere in the middle distance overhead. Yaz had done it from the ground. The way she described it later, she'd spent the whole time we were aboard the command ship keeping the descent units in a running chase through the streets, luring them. Because there are ways to lure something that operates on pattern recognition if you know the patterns. And she'd spent 10 months studying the footage until she knew the patterns, away from civilian populations, and toward the decoy TARDIS, which she'd positioned in an open area with enough space around it that, when it collapsed, the overpressure wouldn't hit any standing structures. She'd been on her own for the entire 47 minutes we were aboard the ship. She'd run several miles. She'd improvised twice when the route she'd planned was blocked, rerouting on the fly with a hand-drawn map she'd made the night before and had folded into her jacket pocket. She'd lost a shoe at some point and hadn't noticed until it was over, until she was standing in the empty space where the second TARDIS had been, and she looked down and saw that one of her feet was just wearing a sock. She'd driven the last of the descent units through the door herself, stood 50 meters away, and transmitted a signal from a device she'd been given, a distress beacon keyed to a frequency that those things respond to because of old hardwired priorities that go back further than the clone's generation. And when they were inside, she'd pressed a button. The second TARDIS folded on itself like paper in a closing fist. There was a sound that wasn't quite a sound, more like the absence of sound, a sudden hollow in the air that the ears interpret as noise because they don't know what else to do with a reality-level event. And then it was gone, and the things inside it were gone with it, into a place where the dimensions work differently and there is no door. I pressed the detonator 3 seconds later. The command ship was roughly 400 kilometers above us. We didn't hear the detonation. We felt it, a brief concussion in the atmosphere, something the barometric pressure registered before the ears did, and then a visible flash at the edge of space if you knew exactly where to look and happened to be looking. Then nothing. Then the 5 remaining ships, receiving no signal from the command vessel, holding position for 22 minutes while their operational protocols processed an absence they weren't designed to accommodate, running a routine that said, await orders from command, finding no command to await, running the routine again. And then, one by one, they pulled back above the horizon and were gone. She told us later that she'd known before we did. That she'd been in the TARDIS watching the signal from the command vessel when it went silent, watching the wall of incoming signal simply stop, cut cleanly, not faded out but ended, and she'd sat there for a moment in the quiet of that and let herself feel it, because there is a version of this where we didn't make it off in time, where Jack's calculation of the escape window was off by 10 seconds, or the unit that fired at us fired a foot to the right, or Robertson's conversation with the command element lasted 30 seconds longer and triggered a sweep that found us. She didn't tell us that in those words. She didn't say it directly at all. But I was standing next to her when she received Jack's all clear, his voice on the comms, calm and dry, and saying, "Everyone accounted for, if you were wondering." And I watched her face do something that it only does when a weight has been removed that it had been carrying for a while. Not relief exactly, more like the body remembering that it can stand without bracing. I recognized it, I felt it. Robertson survived. I want to note that because it bothers me still that men like Robertson survive the things they cause and find a way to make it mean something other than what it was. He was questioned, at length, by people with the right authority and the right clearances. The drone contract was canceled. There were investigations, committees, documents with large sections redacted to black. His lawyers were very good, and the investigation is still technically open as far as I know. which in practice means it has reached the stage of being technically open rather than practically active. He gave a press interview a few months later, said he'd been working to gather intelligence from inside the alien command structure, said he'd put himself in harm's way for humanity. The journalist nodded at appropriate intervals. Robertson's voice was measured and clear, and contained that same quality of a man who has so thoroughly convinced himself of his own version of events that the conviction itself has become a kind of evidence. I watched about 30 seconds of it and turned it off. Leo Rugazi is buried in Manchester, near where he grew up. I went once, about a month after, stood there for a few minutes. The headstone was new, the grass around it still patchy from where it had been laid, the edges not yet settled. He was 26 years old. He was brilliant and curious, and he made a mistake that cost the world very nearly everything, and he didn't live to understand the full weight of it. I don't think he was a bad man. I think he was a curious one who found something extraordinary and couldn't let go of it, and I think that quality is present in all of us, the inability to leave something remarkable alone. The difference between that quality saving the world and ending it is mostly luck and timing, and whether the remarkable thing you can't leave alone is one that benefits from being understood. I left a cup of coffee on the grave. It felt right. It felt like the kind of gesture a young scientist who worked long nights and didn't know what he'd started would have understood. The last morning, we were all standing outside the TARDIS, her TARDIS, the real one, the blue box that has been to the end of time and the beginning of it and back, the battered and extraordinary machine that always looks slightly too small and is never too small. Sheffield in early morning, low cloud, cold air with the first hint of the week's rain in it. A normal day, a normal sky with everything in it that skis are supposed to have and nothing else. Graham talked for a bit. He's good at talking, not in the showy way, not in the way that people who are good at things and know they're good at them perform it, but in the way that people who have driven long, empty roads alone develop, which is to say precisely and without wasted words, finding the useful thing rather than the impressive thing. He said what he'd learned, what he was taking with him. He said he was going to look into a troll invasion in Finland, which made Jack laugh properly for the first time all morning, which I'm fairly sure was the point. I shook Graham's hand. Then I hugged him. Then I told him not to be daft and hugged him properly, the way you hug people when you're not sure when you'll see them again and you want the impression to last. He squeezed the back of my neck once, the way my dad used to, said, "You did good, kid." It took me a second to be able to say anything back. Jack stayed. He had people to find, old connections to go back to, the particular kind of maintenance work that comes with being alive for as long as he's been alive, not just continuing to exist, but continuing to exist among people, which requires a different kind of effort. He told her he'd be in touch, which coming from Jack could mean next Tuesday or 15 years from now or something in between that doesn't map neatly onto calendar time. She told him not to leave it so long this time. They held each other for a moment like people who have been separately not dying for a very long time, and find it unexpectedly useful to confirm that the other one is still real and still standing. Then she looked at me. I'd been thinking for a while about what I was going to say. I'd had months to think about it, the 14 months of her absence, and then the days of the crisis, and then the quiet period after, when the work of clearing up occupied everyone's hands and the quiet evenings left space for thought. I'd written a version in my head during those evenings, something thoughtful and complete that properly communicated what it had meant, all of it, the whole 3 years and the 14 months after. What I said was, "I'm going to stay." She looked at me for a long moment, not surprised exactly, more like she'd been holding space for this and was now receiving it. "Sheffield needs someone," I said, "and someone needs to teach a self-defense class for that group on Burngreave Road, and there are 2 lads in my building who have just aged out of care and they don't know how anything works yet, and I think I'm supposed to be here." "Ryan," she said. "I know," I said. She held both my hands for a moment, the way she does, that particular grip, both hands, full contact, warm and present. I understand now that it's a form of communication between her and whatever she's touching, a way of connecting herself to something so she can feel that it's solid and real and not about to be taken away. She held on for a moment longer than the situation required. Then she let go, and she went inside and the doors closed. The sound started. That sound. I've heard it 100 times and it still does something to my sternum, some physical resonance I can't explain and can't locate precisely, somewhere between sound and feeling. The wheeze and the thud of something asserting its existence in a dimension that wasn't quite expecting it. I stood and listened to it until it was gone, until the space where the TARDIS had been was just air and pavement, and a faint smell of ozone drifting on the Sheffield morning. I stood there a while after that. Then I put my collar up against the cold and walked home. There's still a mark on Fargate Street, near the bottom end, close to where the road meets the crossing. A scorch mark on the paving stones where the first drone discharged its weapon on the morning everything began, where Alec Proctor died on his way to buy bread. The council hasn't repaved it yet. Maybe they will eventually. Maybe they'll leave it, the way cities sometimes leave their damage marks, because there's a kind of honesty in not pretending that smooth pavement is the same as nothing having happened. I walk past it most mornings. I don't stop. I just notice it the way you notice a scar, not with fresh grief every time, but with a steady recognition. This happened. It was real. These are the terms. I think that's the right way to carry something, not to perform it, not to put it away in a box and close the lid and pretend it wasn't there, just to notice it every time and keep walking. We saved the world with pocket explosives and a borrowed teleporter, and 3 people who refused to have a reasonable reaction to unreasonable odds. We did it because we had no other option, and because the alternative was giving up, and none of us, not one was built for giving up. We did it because the thing that was supposed to make us vulnerable, that we're improvising always, that we don't have doctrine or fleet capability or 1,000 years of tactical memory, turned out to be the thing they couldn't account for. You can model an enemy that operates on procedure. You can model a threat that follows a protocol. You can't model a Graham O'Brien who used to be a mechanic and can find an engine coupling in the dark by feel, or a Jack Harkness who's been in worse spots and survived them all, or someone who takes a wall panel off with his hands because the junction is blocked and the spine is on the other side of the wall anyway. You can't plan for people who won't quit, who rewrite the approach when the approach fails, who find the third option when there are only supposed to be 2. I know that now. I knew it before in some less organized way, but now I know it in the bones. I know it the way you know things that have been tested. The city is quiet this morning, cold and ordinary and whole. That's enough.